The stream is live. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we'll just wait till start time to see a few other people join us.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, well, welcome to our industrial relations changes for 2024. We're just about to turn over into the 2025 financial year, coming up to 30 June. And there are a couple of changes affecting employers, a couple of key changes affecting employers that we need you to make sure that you are aware of, and you've got your systems and processes updated to take these into account. So joining me today is Paul Cripps from Payroll Solutions, and we're just going to be doing a fly through of some of the key changes. And of course, this is going to be general information only. So if you want more specific information or more detail, then we suggest that you get in touch with us afterwards, and we can certainly find a way to help you. Or we're going to be pointing out where to find more information during the presentation. So we're going to get underway. And so myself, for those that don't know me, my name is Paul Sweeney, Managing Director of Pretium Solutions, a chartered accountant and business advisory firm. Been doing this for 30 years, working with small, medium businesses, because that's what I love doing. Also the host of the Business Behind Your Business podcast, which is also a great resource for small, medium business owners. And joining me on our seminar today is Paul Cripps, founder of PK People Solutions, providing operational key strategic HR solutions to small, medium business owners. And he's worked with some amazing companies and amazing people in the past. And I have a lot of pleasure talking with Paul, because Paul's quite a regular on the Business Behind Your Business podcast. And why is Paul such a regular? Well, Paul talks about HR and employment issues. And whenever I talk to business owners, that's one of the big three issues. Are my staff, am I paying them correctly? Are they performing? How do I make sure I'm not breaching any rules? So it's a big issue. It keeps a lot of small business owners awake. And that's why Paul is a regular on the small business podcast called The Business Behind Your Business. So, Paul, welcome to the microphone. It's great to catch up with you. You're very busy at the moment.
Likewise, Paul. Great to be on this live stream. We've done a few podcasts together, so this is taking me outside my comfort zone and doing something live, so I can't be edited. So which always makes me slightly nervous. But yes, I'm quite busy at the moment. It's been a busy year, and I think that I've certainly been working this year on some very exciting pieces of work, and there are pieces of work which are what I call the necessary part, and some of the changes that need to be made as businesses have to navigate with. I think probably the last 2 years, probably some. Definitely about some of the largest changes employment legislation that have come about really probably since about the mid 2000s. So so it's been quite a lot going on, and that continues to be the case as well.
Yeah, so a lot of changes, and with so many changes, I believe, and from the conversations we've been having, there's a lot of changes that many business owners are not aware of, and there's a trap there because ignorance is not an excuse for non-compliance.
No, you're absolutely right, Paul. And I think that, and look, primarily today we're looking at the, if you like, the current changes in terms of ones in the very recent past and the ones coming up in the next 12 months. Equally, I'm coming across clients that are still grappling with some of the changes that happened in 22, which is still the recent past, really, in a way. But you're absolutely right. Ignorance is not bliss, and I do come across businesses at times that feel if they're classified as a small business, and we might get into the definition of that a bit later on, then they believe actually they're exempt. But the fact is, with a lot of this legislation, it doesn't matter if you employ 5,000 people or one person. you're actually held by legislation. So, there isn't the exemption for thinking that you're a small business. Therefore, you're not covered by this legislation. So there's a lot where there's no benefits to spend on the business size.
So there's a lot of things that as a business owner you need to be aware of, and this is where we're always saying that a business owner is generally very good at what they do, but there are things that they shouldn't be doing. And I think looking after your own HR is probably one of those areas where if you look after it yourself, you're going to fall foul at some point. So it's best to get some good advice. So, Paul, before we jump into these industrial relations changes, there's a couple of other changes that employers need to be aware of, and these are more on the taxation side. We're just going to look at these very quickly because they take effect from 1 July. And as we said, we're just about to tick over into the 2025 financial year. So I might just quickly look at those. And the first one that comes to mind is the change to the superannuation guarantee rate. So that is increasing on the 1st of July, 2024. So it's increasing from 11% to 11.5%. And the trap here is that the 11.5% applies to the pay run that is paid on or after the 1st of July. So even if your pay week ends on the 30th of June, but you pay on the 1st of July, then you are required to pay the 11.5% on that, which is going to be a trap for a lot of people. So there may be some people getting caught by that. And the second one, which we've all been hearing about, is the stage 3 tax cuts. And those tax cuts that will change the pay-as-you-go withholding. So your employees will be having less taken out of their salary and wages from the first full week of pay after 1st of July. Now, what we've got to be careful of here is that we actually incorporate these changes into our payroll. But if you're in Australia and you're on single touch payroll, which if you're not on single touch payroll, that's another discussion we need to have because you should be by now. But you should be using a payroll software or a payroll reporting tool that is calculating the correct pay-as-you-go withholding and the correct superannuation guarantee. And those changes will be incorporated within those tables. So you should automatically be deducting the correct amount of tax and paying the correct amount of superannuation. So those two changes apply very much straight away and affect every employer. So no excuse. We've been hearing about stage 3 tax cuts for many years, but they're now in place from the 1st of July. So those two are very quick, but ones that we need to be aware of. So they will take effect 1st of July. Make sure your payroll system is up to date. But if you're using Xero, QuickBooks, MYB, those tools, they will already be in place. So we'll move on from those because we've been hearing about them, but just a last minute reminder. Now, the two more things we want to talk about today, Paul, national minimum wage increase and what's the implications of that? And we've got some facts up on the screen at the moment as our first thing. And we're going to talk about some of the other industrial relations changes after, but if you can just run through what are the key changes and what are the implications, because there's some flow-on effect from this minimum wage increase.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly, Paul. I think that I think first of all, just in terms of the change in superannuation, it seems to be we're finally getting to that magic 12% mark that I think was first talked about possibly as much as 12 years ago. And that's certainly possibly even longer than that. I know it got delayed for a number of years at one point. I remember super sitting at 9.25%, 9.5% for many years. And finally we've got up to these 0.5% increases. Now, so we don't believe there's any more after that, but who knows, that could change. But certainly in terms of these increases, so this is the annual wage increase that comes through from Fair Work based on the national minimum wage, but also award rates as well. So really any employer needs to be aware if they're paying people at the award, those award rates are going to change as of 1st of July. Paul, I'll stand corrected on this. I believe the same rules apply, don't they, in terms of it's actually when it's actually paid. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe it. Well, actually, the new national wage, what we've got there is the first full pay period after 1st of July. So it's slightly different to superannuation guarantee.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah. So look, so I think it's a case of checking out. I think the other thing as well is that I find some employers talk about paying above award. And I do find sometimes some employers that talk about paying above award and perhaps have paid above award for a number of years. But there's been some fairly hefty increases in the award rate increases, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years. If you're an employer and you believe you're paying above award, now is a very good time to very closely look at that again. It is a case sometimes that I hear of employers that are getting caught out because the increases of percentage-wise have happened quite rapidly, whereas an employer may have been paying something that was well above the award for a particular role. That's actually caught up over a period of time. So that's really probably the some of the key thoughts I have on that. And I think also it's a good opportunity for for employers to really make sure that they can do what they can to try and systemize some of this as well. For a larger employer, there is software out there that will do award interpretation as well. Now, that may not be right for a smaller business, but for a business that's a little bit bigger and they're paying an award, sometimes that can be a good option for them.
Mm. Yeah, and I think one of the traps as well is that people think the national minimum wage doesn't apply because I'm paying somebody on an award, but those increases have sort of been flowed through to the wage rates that apply in the award. So you need to be double careful about that.
Absolutely right. The headlines can sometimes be misleading on this. Whilst the headlines always come out about the national minimum wage, and they apply to all award rates as well. So basically, any employer needs to look at this if they pay at award, but equally, if they've haven't looked at in terms of where they actually benchmark against the award rate for some time, then now's a good time to do that as well, to make sure they're not caught out by that. Because one of the things I'm going to talk about in a while is also around some increasing penalties for underpayment, on the basis that unfortunately these sort of things, ignorance is not an excuse. Basically the emphasis is very much on the expectation that as an employer knows what they're doing when they employ people, and basically there's an expectation on part of the employer that they will be compliant with these changes, and that makes it, as we said before, it actually makes it quite hard because there's a lot for employers to get their heads around.
Yeah, and I guess where's the starting point to look for the awards and the award rates?
Yeah, no, it's actually very easy to navigate through the Fair Work website. So award rates are published on the Fair Work site, and actually there's actually a very good tool on there as well that is called the PACT Pay Calculator. So that's PACT. That's a particularly good tool for any employer. Very easy to navigate and use. What the health warning I would always give is that employers should be looking for the rates, but they should also make sure that the role that their employees benchmarked against under what's known as classifications is actually the right classification for the work that employee is undertaking. Best scenario is whereby there is actually a job description or a position description, as it's sometimes called, in place. So that can be used to benchmark that against the definitions that are listed on the award. But that's what I would say though is that sometimes, and I haven't checked as yet, because sometimes it's these award rates get published quite late in the day. So the only health warning, because I haven't actually looked at it in the past week and a half, is that sometimes the PAC calculator may actually have they may have not loaded the new rates in there as yet. So just be careful in terms of it's actually showing the rates as of 1st July 2024. And indeed, that will be on the listing as well as the PAC calculator. So there's two places to look there.
Yeah. So Paul, okay. So there's a place to go to check that, and that's a good thing. But I think talking about Fair Work is probably a good way to move on to our to our next point, which is talking about there's a bunch of industrial relations changes, and they're all under this framework of closing loopholes, which yeah, so it's an interesting scenario. And I think what you alluded to earlier is there's been so many changes over the past 2 or 3 years, and a lot of them have sort of, well, I guess some of us would argue they've happened a bit by stealth with the timing and of the announcements, but there's quite a few announcements or changes that have come into effect. So there's, we're looking here at, a 2-year time period of some of the changes. So do you have some comments on why we've got so many different dates?
Yeah, it's a good question. The why, I'm not sure I can answer. But the fact is that, look, I think for whatever reason, we have had a lot of changes in legislation. Look, I mean, sometimes that is something which does happen sometimes when there is a change of government that settles, that makes certain promises that they're going to make when they govern. And to be honest, we've got a timeline here, which is the if you like, the current timeline. I would actually also say that I'm also come across employers that are still catching up from some of the changes that occurred in 22 as well. Now, what I would say on that is never too late to make a change. So if you're a little bit behind on that, you're not the only employer that's behind on some of the changes that took place then. And to just very, very briefly name, because it's not the purpose of why we've got this live stream today. Probably the 2 key changes probably. I would say that I've come across is the changing in the laws relating to bullying, and also some of the laws relating to psychosocial risk in terms of from work health and safety perspective. So if you like, the psychological safety of employees. I find a lot of employers really aren't up to speed with that, but that was in the past. So that really is already these changes that are now coming in from the latter part of last year and over the next year or so.
Right, so that they're in addition to these changes.
They're in addition to these today. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Look, I think, to be honest, in terms of these, we've got down here. Look, there's there's been I could like this. I really don't like this concept of closing loopholes. In terms of a name, and I'm allowed to. It's a free country. I'm allowed to express an opinion on this matter. I think it's quite a confusing term. So anyway, but it is what it is. And there's actually been two. There's actually been a part 1 and a part 2 of this as well. So what we're trying to do is sort of cover them both. And look, to be honest with you, in terms of some of these key changes, whilst there are 7 of them in total, there's probably really just 2 of them that I'm going to point out in a fair amount of detail. I'm going to talk a bit about right to disconnect, and also the casual employment changes. And the interesting thing is that. From my perception, and of course, I could be considered to be someone that's that probably has ears attuned to hearing things that within my field. But from my perception is that I've seen more press on right to disconnect than I have the casual employment law changes. Whereas actually for an employer, probably for a lot of employers, the casual employment changes probably have a larger impact than the right to disconnect. Now, that's obviously generalized view, because there are others that will be that will be caught by right to disconnect, and I can cover that in a second. We've got the others down there as well. So I mean, there is some changes in terms of the definition of independent contractors. I'm not going to talk about unions, registered organisation changes, and enterprise bargaining agreement, because to be honest with you, they're really very specialised areas, which I'll be the first to admit I don't have the expertise in. So my view is that if you are working in a small to medium-sized business that's unionised or has an enterprise agreement, you do need to get advice from a usual industrial relations expert on that, because that is a very specialised area.
Okay, so I think let's start with casual employment, because that's the one you've highlighted as being the most important. So I guess there's two things that come to my mind here. Is one is the first application date being 26 August 2024.
Yep.
And yet in the information, we've got a different start date applying to small business employers, which is, I think, the 26th of August 2025. So, yeah, why do we have two dates? I guess you're not a good person to answer that.
Why do we have two dates? Look, I think first of all, I'm just going to step back and say that, and actually, the slide's a bit confusing. But let me just first of all just step back in terms of what do we mean by a small business? I have a client that employs about 80 people, and they consider themselves to be a small family business. Under the definition, they're not a small family business. There's a key number when it comes to being classed as a small business, and that is actually as soon as you employ person number 15. Now, the trap is two traps in that. Person number 15 also includes any not just permanent employees, but also includes people that are employed casually or under fixed-term contracts. That's for the one place where employers can get caught. The second one is that are there any associated entities, and those entities don't just purely need to be in Australia. They could be overseas entities. I've got one client in particular who has downsized within Australia. At the moment, I think they do tip 17 employees, but they're getting very close to being 14. But because they're owned by an overseas entity that employs several hundred people, they wouldn't be covered by the legislation as a small business employer. I actually think, Paul, there's actually and some of the information that comes out here is somewhat confusing. But my understanding actually when it comes to the two dates is that I believe actually the two dates of the 26th of August of this year and the 26th of August next year actually applies to right to disconnect, not the casual employment changes. My understanding reading this, and I stand corrected if that is wrong, is that it's actually the casual employment changes that will apply regardless of employment size. I'll come back to right to disconnect in a moment if that's okay. So I suppose one thing I would say is that when I've been talking to some employers about these upcoming changes, some of them have actually been quoting back to me to some of the changes that came in 2022. So they've only in the very recent past gone through some changes in definition about how to handle casual employees. And again, like 2 years later, we've got some more, which is I have to say is somewhat frustrating. It's certainly not the kind of work that I enjoy getting involved in, but it is necessary for employers to understand what these changes mean. I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible, but the previous changes that came in really talk to the contract being the most important aspect in defining the relationship in terms of whether an employee would be a casual or whether it could be defined as a full-time employee. And this came out, and actually it was 22. It was actually 2021 where this definition came out. So the new definition is. It talks about it's actually what actually happens in practice. So what does that actually mean in terms of what happens in practice? So somebody is actually employed as a casual, and their contract says they're a casual. However, they are working regular and systematic hours. Then that person down the track could be classed as they should have been a permanent employee. Now, sorry, Paul, I've kind of said something there which may be very confusing. Do you want to replay that to me to make sure that I've explained to you correct, and then we can go on to a bit further?
And I think that's one of the traps I see is that someone, and particularly, the first step is you talked about the contract here, and a lot of small business owners, particularly when they're employing somebody who might be a friend or a relation or somebody, they ignore the need to have a contract. That's the first issue I see. The second one is where they've had the same person and let's say they've worked Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday every year, same hours for the last 6 years.
Yep.
But they still view them as a casual. But what I'm understanding is that under these changes, they are actually deemed to be a permanent employee. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I think it's a bit looser than that in terms of they could be deemed to be a permanent employee. The best piece of advice that I've given on this for a few years now, in terms of to help employers, is that one of the key things I think employers should do is they should do what I call a breakdown of the rate. So they should spell out what is the base rate for this employee, what is the casual loading, and the casual loading should always be 25%, and then what is the total rate. And I guess I'd say probably an hourly rate is a good one to go by. That's a way that if ever there is a determination this person is actually a permanent employee, then at that point in time, there would be some justification that, well, okay, this person's a permanent employee. However, for quite some period of time, it's been very clear that they have been compensated for the entitlements that they don't get as a permanent employee that they with this 25%. So the idea of the 25% is to compensate casual employees who don't receive any benefits from an annual leave or from a personal leave perspective. Does that? And I think actually one other thing, Paul, I think you said there as well. You're quite right in terms of, and I do come across, people that you're absolutely right, where there is no contract in place. Well, look, the good news there is sometimes it's better to have no contract than to have a really poorly drafted contract. That's the only the only plus point. But look, it's always a good idea to get something in writing. It's not a difficult thing to get a compliant contract in place. Sometimes employers can get hold of them through industry bodies. Sometimes there are some free contracts that sit around there that on Fair Work, for example. Don't always think they're the best drafted, which may sound controversial, but that's not the first time I've heard that. But it's worthwhile just getting some help to make sure that the right kind of contract's put in place, would be my view.
Okay, so we might move on, but before we do that, can we just summarise what the current changes for casuals are, or the new changes that are applying for casuals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So look, I think the first thing in terms of what I would suggest employers do basically is conduct an audit in terms of what casuals they actually have in place at the moment. Two key things you need to know really in terms of really in terms of, well, what are their hours and how long have they worked for that particular business. I think the key changes are. Say that the definition in terms of what might be considered to be a casual. There is also some of the changes that came out as part of the 21 changes were around this casual conversion process as well. Now, the casual conversion process under the previous changes was, I think, confusing to the point that I think a lot of employers just got lost in terms of setting up a process. The point now is that the new change has to come via a request from the employee, and that has to happen. That can happen basically after a period of employment of 6 months. This is where there are change between small and large. 6 months for a business of 15 or more people, or 12 months for a business of less than 15 people. At that point in time, that's a one-off. That's not something that happens regularly. The other thing I think that's going to be important on this as well is that there is an obligation on the part of the employer, and this is where if you like, businesses don't use contracts, to provide a casual Fair Work information statement. And that's a free resource that's always available on the Fair Work website. That's something which we haven't seen as yet because these changes don't come out until August. But it's that's something that needs to be given out to any casual employees, and it needs to be given out upon commencement. But there is also a requirement for business to give that out either the 6 or the 12-month period, depending on whether it's a small or a large business. I have heard some industrial relations commentators say that this is a process designed to make it very awkward to casual employees, to the point that employers don't. That might be a bit of a cynical view. I think I would argue that some of this is actually creates, once again, a bit of a burden on the part of employers. But I think a lot of this is actually just getting systems in place to try and manage this. And once you've got a system in place to manage this, it becomes more straightforward. But key thing, I think, for the moment for employers is just to really just at this stage just check in with who you've got in terms of who is employed as a casual, how long have they been in your business for, and what is their pattern of hours, because those are going to be the key determining factors. I'm sorry, I will add that one more again, Paul. Again, stress over and over again. In terms of documentation, really important, I think, to have a contract, but the split of hours is something which I would say that if your employer that doesn't show the loading rates in the contract at the moment, that's a really key thing to make sure is in there going forward.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Paul. We might move on to the next, so I guess the more news-friendly topic, which is the right to disconnect. Now, often heard that people have trouble disconnecting from their phones anyway, but that's not the type of disconnection we're talking about here. It's something a little bit different, I believe.
Yeah, it is. Yes, and look, I think that this is something which has probably, as it comes up, and once again, it comes up as a headline, people interpret this in different ways and think it might mean different things. It isn't something which says employers can't, email or send messages outside of working hours, and it isn't something that says an employer can't call an employee outside of working hours. And neither, and probably I should add, in terms of some of the other things that are in these changes as well, it's not a criminal offence to do so. The key thing there is that an employee, in some circumstances, would basically be employed in such a way that there isn't an obligation for them to feel they absolutely have to respond. So if they're taking, if they're on leave, or it's there, or it's out of hours, or it's on the weekend, effectively, employee shouldn't be penalised for not responding. Now, I think there is a few things I think I want to say on that. There will be, depending on the role of the employee has in the business, there could be some employees where, well, look, there is an expectation as part of their role that that actually they are required to work out of hours. I mean, I've spent probably far too many years of my working life connecting with people in far-flung places in the globe, mostly the US and the UK, and that seems to be something that even follows me in my business now. Sometimes there will be an expectation that there will be a need to have these kind of calls outside of working hours. Now, usually the advice, rather, I would give in that perspective is to make sure that there is clarity there, and that clarity could come a number of different ways. That clarity could come in terms of their employment contract in particular, and there will be an expectation if somebody is in a role where there is a need for them to be available outside of what might consider normal working hours. They're compensated accordingly. I mean, I think the thought process on this piece of legislation, and as I said, it is just a thought process at this stage, is that this is really down to people perhaps that are potentially in lower paid roles, award level roles, to really, well, they really aren't compensated appropriately to have extensive contact outside of working hours. And there could be ways around that. There could be ways around that for employers that need that. There could be things like on-call allowances that might be available that could be put and added to their wages. So I think that, as I say, it's a piece of legislative change which is caused a bit of confusion. And I think the thing I'd say as well is that at the moment this obviously doesn't come in until the 26th of August, and I think it'll be, as always when it's new, it'll be interesting to see what sort of things come through and what sort of things get challenged. This is the one, just to be clear, where there is a difference in terms of effective dates. So for businesses that employ 15 or more people, so they don't fall under the small business definition, this comes in as of 26th of August this year. For small employers, it comes in. You've got another year and a bit's grace on the 26th of August, 2025. Paul, any thoughts on that yourself?
Look, I think we're probably in this situation where a lot of, there's a bit of what I call scaremongering going on in the media. And so like looking for a good news story. There's some very practical reasons why you do need to be contacted or to contact people outside, and particularly in a small business. The level of reliance is quite heavy at times. So let's say you're in a small business, but you have a dedicated IT person, and something goes wrong. Well, you're going to need to contact them. But if you're making the regular habit of contacting this person during non-work times, and I'm often thinking like in after hours, during meal times, on weekends, unnecessarily for things that could wait, then that's perhaps there's an issue there. But it's a bit sad that we've actually got to have a piece of legislation to govern what I call common sense and just sensibility. But I know it has been abused quite considerably by some employers. But I think we're in this situation. We've got legislation brought in to capture the activities of a small few, but it's going to have some implications for everybody.
Yes, no, I agree, Paul. I love the common sense approach. Often I hear common sense isn't that common, but it's an impression I hear a lot. So, but yes, look, you're absolutely right. I think that this is not designed to stop people, for the ad hoc sort of question that might come up. This is really designed to stop employers really just continually contacting, and effectively, I suppose you could argue it's down to some employers that may have been contacting employees regularly outside of working hours, and as always, it comes under this wonderful word that's used in terms of what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, which is this you get this a lot in employment legislation at some very grey areas, which sometimes they're sometimes the answer that might come through if a legal case comes up, they can perplex a lot of people, including some people that are far more qualified in this space than me, and that's been consistent, throughout my career in this industry of once these things go to the courts, you just don't know what might come out. But look, I think we'll have to see what comes out on this in terms of cases that come out. But the real intent really is to try and protect people probably that may have been contacted continuously. You say for maybe things that are less important. But there are people obviously in a small business that are that need to provide support, and it's making sure that there is an understanding that that's needed, and that might mean that there is compensation for people, particularly if they're not highly paid individuals.
So I think there's a couple of points I just want to sort of revisit a little bit, and one is this right. What it's saying is that employers not prevented from emailing or sending a message. Now, correct. I guess where the issue is where they have an expectation that the employee will respond.
Correct.
And I think you need to make it very clear that, okay, just because I've sent you an email on the weekend because I'm working, doesn't mean I expect a response. But then the other question I've got is, why are you monitoring your work email on the weekend? Now, that's assuming that the employer is emailing to a work email address. You shouldn't be expected to be monitoring that unless you're on an on-call basis, and then that would be legitimate. But if the employer is emailing to a personal address, I think that might be an area that needs to be looked at. The second thing there is, we've been becoming more and more connected and all the time, and we're relying on our phones so much that we have this trouble of saying no. And we've, over the last 3 to 4 years, particularly, our dependence on smartphones has really increased, and it's that hard, not being able to disconnect. Now, how many times have during this presentation have we been tempted to pick up the phone and check what's going on while we're here? I'm honestly, I'm going to say I haven't. But
no, I can hear mine, but I'm just ignoring it.
But I believe that I think the studies are showing that it takes 8 minutes. 8 minutes is about the most that the average person can stand without checking for messaging. So I think we're sort of got into the habit of checking those things constantly, and then now we're at a stage where we've realized that we need to step back from this, and smartphones and all of this is great, but it's actually intruding on a lot of our personal matters. And I guess it's a case of, well, if the employee doesn't have the control to stop monitoring and say no, then perhaps we've got to go back to the employer and say, well, just don't send. Like, I know a lot of email programs and text messaging, if it's not urgent, you can actually set a delay to say, don't send this until 9 a.m. Monday morning. Don't send it on the weekend. Then that way your employee is not tempted to look at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's actually a very good piece of advice, Paul. I found myself out of choice working on something yesterday, but certainly set the emails to go out today because I didn't want to intrude on the clients that I was working for on their weekend. They don't need to see it themselves on the weekend, but that could apply for an employer as well. In terms of if they have a choice that they, for whatever reason, want to work at different hours, then they've got the ability to set that to go out at a different time. And I think that this almost creeps a little bit into some of the well-being space as well, doesn't it? I think in terms of we've got this scenario whereby our smartphones deliver information to us that we don't necessarily always need to see. But there is sometimes then a feeling that, I need to jump on that, or a feeling of anxiety that might creep in terms of, well, I need to respond to that straight away. And I think that I guess probably this is probably one of the reasons why we've got this piece of legislation that's come through. Look, I mean, I guess as I said there on pause, I think probably there are reasons why there are scenarios where perhaps the situation has been abused, but I think that it's an interesting one in terms of it's hard to predict at this stage in terms of what sort of cases might come out and what might be determined to be reasonable or unreasonable. But I think some of the initial advice on this is, it's very much, trying to make sure there is some clarity there, and there is something that's actually specified. If an employer feels that there is likely to be, some form of, need to, regularly contacting employers outside of hours and expect a response, or it should be a clarity to say, look, I may choose to email you at different times. That's my choice as an employer, but don't feel obligated to respond until it's your work time. That could be another practical solution as well.
And so as an employer, if you're trying to implement a safe policy here, I'm guessing that you need to review your employee handbook, your policies and procedures, and make sure that your employees are aware of that, and have some and look, in the absence of legislation, go to your employees and say that this is how we're going to approach this piece of this new rule.
Yep.
And maybe say, well, hang on, is that reasonable for you? Do you have an issue with it? And then listen to them and say, well, hang on, what are the issues that they're having? And are they real issues? And then, it's something that we can work through. I think we've got this overly prescriptive way of, I think that it's a case of everybody's being treated as if everybody does the wrong thing.
Yes.
And that's the assumption, I think, that we see in a lot of our legislation, that we'll treat you that you're going to break the law, not that we're going to treat you that you're trying in your best efforts to run a business properly, but being fair and equitable to your employees. Yep. But I think we do have this situation where we have this, the legislation is based on the assumption that one person's done the wrong thing, therefore all employers do the wrong thing. Yep. But, as an employer, you can have those lines of communication with your employees, open them up, make sure that you've got some sensible policies and procedures. And unfortunately, we're going to have to watch this space and see what does come out of the courts.
It is, and look, to be certainly at the moment, I think you're absolutely right, Paul. I think it is at this stage, it is more likely to be a conversation. It might be something that might creep into an employment contract in terms of expectations. But look, it could well be in terms of it might be something that might creep into policies and procedures down the track. But I think, to me, it starts with a conversation and having a sensible conversation to set expectations, really, in terms of what might be happening and what the expectations of employees are. Totally agree. I think that's a sensible approach.
So a lot of changes going on for employers to look at. Some of them are very easy. So the ones we talked about right at the beginning today, super guaranteed changes, tax cut changes, very simple for you to implement. They should be part of your payroll software.
Yes.
But some of these other changes, and we talked about the 7 current items, and we focused on 2 of them in our conversation here. But there are 7 items, but there's also a whole host of still fairly recent changes that came into play. So my take on, sorry?
I'll call it the back catalogue, Paul. I think probably is one way to describe it.
Yes, well, that's one way. So I think if you're an employer at the moment, a small business employer particularly, my advice would be don't go it alone. Don't go it alone. Get some advice. Reach out. I guess Fair Work have a lot of resources on their website, which would be a good place to start having a look. But in most cases, you're going to probably want some clarification or some, some interpretation from an objective source that's working with your best interest in place. So that's where you would reach out to say Paul Cripps, and I'm sure Paul would welcome to have those conversations with you about how he can help you make sure that you're not just compliant with these rules, these new changes, but you can actually use these as an opportunity. And I know from our conversations in the past, Paul, it's been about not looking at these as a rule that we have to comply with, but it's a change in how we need to approach our employees, but there's also opportunities to come up with a better solution for both the employee and the business.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Paul. And look, I think when I tend to work with new clients, it is often a case of trying to help them navigate either a change first of all, or to navigate a problem. But to me, that's not the core reason why I'm in business. The core reason why I'm in business is to help employers actually try and get the best performance out of their people. And create a workplace where these things are really more hygiene factors as opposed to nuisance factors. I heard it described quite recently where probably these sort of things would be where HR is considered to be a bit of a cost center, and the real reason why I exist is to try and help businesses get the best value out of their people. So you could argue that's the profit center part of what I do.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of issues there we've talked about today. I'm just going to put Paul's details back up on the screen. Do encourage you to reach out to him either directly through email, LinkedIn, or on the website. Lots of resources available, and I'm sure Paul would be happy to have a conversation with you to see how we can actually help you get the best outcome for both you as the business owner and your employees. So that's what we're focusing on here. And look, we're curious to find out, how are some of these changes affecting your business? What's some of the things that are going through your mind as you're thinking about all of these changes? Does it mean you're going to just say, well, look, it's all too hard, I'm going to cut back the number of employees, or look at some alternate way of operating your business? Are you going to be looking at increasing your prices to factor in those increased costs that you've got now? You've got super guarantee and pay rises. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are about some of these changes and how it's going to impact your business. We'd be interested to hear from you, and we'll try and get in touch as well if you want to open that line of conversation. So thank you again for listening, and thank you, Paul, for your time again and for sharing your experience and some insights into these new changes, which have caught a few people by surprise. But it doesn't have to be a hard task. We can get through it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Paul, for having me again on this live stream today.
No problem. It's great to have you with us. And look, if you want to get in touch with us, reach out to us on any of these channels, or put comments in the comment section below, and we'll get in touch with you. So thank you again. Thank you, Paul, and thanks for joining us.